The most dangerous person in your life is rarely the one who attacks you. It's the one who smiles, offers a hand, and calls it help, while quietly making sure you never stand on your own. That's what this is about today. Not villains, not obvious enemies, but the quiet architecture of people who perform assistance while engineering your dependence. By the end of this, you'll be able to spot the difference between a hand that lifts you and a hand that holds you down while pretending to lift. Here's the first thing you need to understand. And it's the foundation everything else is built on. Help is not defined by the action. It's defined by the direction of the outcome. Real help increases your capacity. It leaves you stronger, more capable, more independent than before. Fake help, the performative kind, increases the helper's control. It leaves you needing them a little more than you did yesterday. Same gesture, same words, opposite architecture. And most people never learn to tell the two apart because they were taught to judge intention by tone of voice instead of by outcome over time. Psychologists have a term for a version of this that plays out inside close relationships. The covert contract. It's an unspoken agreement one person makes in their own head, then acts on as if the other person agreed to it too. Someone does something for you, covers a bill, stays late to help with a project, gives advice you didn't ask for, but underneath there's a silent clause. You now owe me. Not stated, not negotiated, just assumed. And when you don't repay that invisible debt the way they expected, they feel betrayed, even though you never signed anything. This is the mechanism behind a huge amount of resentment in families, friendships, and workplaces. One party believes they were generous. The other party never agreed to the terms of that generosity. The help was real on the surface and transactional underneath, and the transaction was never disclosed. Now here's where it gets more interesting, because covert contracts explain individual acts, but they don't explain the pattern. The person who does this again and again across years has a personality style rather than a single moment of weakness. For that, we need to look at a framework developed by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman in the 1960s called the drama triangle. It maps three roles people unconsciously rotate through in dysfunctional dynamics: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. The rescuer is the one that matters most here, because the rescuer is the role that wears the mask of help most convincingly. A rescuer doesn't wait to be asked. They insert themselves into your problem before you finish describing it. They solve things for you rather than with you. And critically, this is the tell. They need you to stay slightly incapable because their entire identity is built on being needed. A rescuer who successfully helps someone become fully independent has just made themselves unnecessary. So on some level, often one they'd never admit even to themselves, they're not motivated to finish the job. They're motivated to keep the job open forever. Think about how this shows up in ordinary life. A manager who helps a talented employee by keeping every important client relationship funneled through himself so the employee can never operate without him in the room. A parent who helps an adult child by solving every financial problem before the child has to sit with the discomfort of solving it themselves, ensuring the child never fully individuates. A friend who helps by constantly offering unsolicited advice about your relationship, your career, your choices. Advice that, if you look closely, always seems to nudge you toward decisions that keep you closer to them and further from options that don't include them. None of these people would describe themselves as manipulative. Most of them genuinely believe they are the good guy in the story. That's what makes this pattern so hard to detect and so hard to confront. The performer usually isn't lying to you. They're lying to themselves first, and you're just the audience for a performance they've already convinced themselves is authentic. This is where we need to bring in a concept from social psychology called impression management, first formalized by sociologist Irving Goffman. Goffman argued that all social life is a kind of theater. We all have a front stage self we present to others and a backstage self that holds our actual motives. Most people do this benignly. It's simply called being polite, being professional, reading the room. But some people build an entire identity on the front stage performance of virtue. Being seen as helpful becomes more important to them than being helpful. And once that flips, Something subtle but severe happens. Their help starts optimizing for how it looks rather than what it produces. They'll help you in front of an audience more readily than in private. They'll bring up favors they've done for you in conversations with other people. They'll frame their assistance in language that centers their own generosity rather than your progress. Watch for that shift in language. Genuine help talks about your result. Performed help talks about their contribution. There's a deeper layer underneath this, and it has to do with power rather than kindness at all. Helping someone creates an automatic power asymmetry, even when neither person intends it. The helper temporarily holds more resources, more knowledge, more capability than the person receiving help. That's simply the mechanics of the exchange. Healthy people are uncomfortable with that asymmetry and try to close it as fast as possible, transferring the skill or resource so the gap disappears. But some people find that asymmetry intoxicating. They don't consciously choose to keep you dependent. They simply never feel the internal pull to close the gap, because the gap is where their sense of importance lives. Take away the gap, and you take away the only room in which they feel powerful. This is why you'll sometimes notice a strange flicker of discomfort in a person's face the moment you announce real progress or independence. A truly generous mentor lights up when you outgrow them. A rescuer in disguise goes quiet or suddenly finds a new problem to insert themselves into. There's a related but distinct mechanism worth separating out here, because it's often confused with the rescuer pattern, and it isn't the same thing at all. Learned helplessness. Psychologist Martin Seligman documented this decades ago in a set of experiments that, however uncomfortable, revealed something essential about how dependence actually gets installed in a mind. Subjects repeatedly exposed to outcomes they couldn't control eventually stopped trying to control anything at all. Even after the situation changed and control became available again, the paralysis outlived the cause. Translate that into human relationships and you get something chilling. A person doesn't need to be actively sabotaged to become dependent. They just need enough repeated experiences of someone else always handles this, that the muscle for handling it themselves quietly atrophies. This means a rescuer doesn't have to intend harm to produce it. Good intentions, repeated at the wrong moments in the wrong domains, can install the exact same helplessness that a manipulator would install on purpose. That's a harder problem to solve than spotting a villain, because now you have to evaluate patterns of well-meaning behavior, not just motives. Let's bring in one more mechanism, because it explains why so many of us say yes to this kind of help, even when some part of us senses something is off. Robert Cialdini, who spent his career studying influence, identified reciprocity as one of the most powerful and least examined forces in human behavior. We are wired to feel obligated to return a favor, and that wiring evolved for good reason. It's the glue of cooperative societies. But wiring built for survival doesn't come with a filter for who's exploiting it. A person who understands reciprocity, even instinctively rather than academically, can create obligation on command. Give something small and unsolicited, and you've planted a seed of debt in someone's mind before they've had a chance to evaluate whether they wanted the exchange at all. This is why the most effective performative helpers rarely wait to be asked. Waiting to be asked would give you time to think. Offering first, before you've even framed the problem, skips that step and installs the obligation before your judgment gets a vote. Now, a story worth sitting with, because abstractions land harder with a concrete case. In the early 20th century, a wealthy industrialist built one of the most extensive philanthropic operations in American history, funding schools, libraries, medical research on a scale that genuinely transformed public health and education for millions of people. Historians still debate the man's motives, and that debate itself is the point. Some of that giving, by his own private writings, was a way of managing guilt over how the fortune was built in the first place. Some of it was strategic, funding causes that quieted criticism and shaped public opinion of the family name for generations. And some of it appears to have been sincere. The lesson isn't about that particular man. It's about the fact that enormous, real, measurable good and self-interested motive can coexist in the exact same act, at the exact same time without contradiction. This is uncomfortable because we want our villains obviously villainous and our helpers obviously pure. Reality doesn't cooperate with that need. A person can build you a library and manage their own reputation with the same gesture. Judging help purely on outcome and separately purely on motive are two different exercises, and confusing them is exactly how sophisticated performers slip through the cracks of our judgment. Let's zoom into a domain most people underestimate: money. Financial dependency is one of the oldest and most effective leashes in human history, precisely because it disguises itself as generosity so easily. A partner who insists on managing all the household finances so you don't have to worry about it is offering something that sounds like relief and functions like control. Because a person who doesn't know where the money is, how much there is, or how it moves has no real exit option, regardless of how the relationship is going. This isn't a claim that every partner who manages finances is manipulative. Plenty of couples do this by mutual, informed, revisited agreement, and that's entirely healthy. The distinction is whether the arrangement is transparent and reversible or opaque and permanent by design. Ask yourself, in any relationship where someone else handles a resource for you, could I take this back over tomorrow if I needed to, competently, without their cooperation? If the honest answer is no, you're not being helped. You're being held. There's a version of this that plays out at scale in organizations, and it's worth naming because most people experience it without ever identifying the mechanism. Some managers build what looks like an incredibly supportive culture, always available, always willing to jump in, always praised by their team for being so hands-on. But look at what actually happens to the team skill over a 2 or 3 year window. Does anyone on that team become capable of running the function without the manager in the room? Or does every person on that team quietly become more specialized in needing that one manager's particular judgment, style, and approval? A manager optimizing for your growth measures success by how replaceable they've made themselves. A manager optimizing for their own security measures success by how indispensable they've made themselves feel, and dresses that indispensability up as devotion to the team. The team feels supported either way. Only one version is actually being served. Here's a sharper distinction worth drawing between two kinds of guiding relationships that get lumped together constantly: mentorship and sponsorship of dependency. A real mentor transfers judgment. They don't just tell you what to do in a given situation. They explain the reasoning well enough that next time you don't need them for that category of decision at all. Every good mentoring conversation should make you need that person slightly less for the next problem of that type. If you notice that after months or years of mentorship, you still can't make decisions in that domain without checking in first, that's not a slow learner problem. That's a sign the transfer was never actually happening. The information was being dispensed in a way engineered to require redelivery, not internalization. Let's talk about the emotional bait that keeps this cycle running, because manipulation of this kind rarely works through logic. It works through guilt and gratitude, weaponized. Gratitude is one of the healthiest emotions a human being can feel. It's also one of the easiest to exploit, because a grateful person feels obligated, and an obligated person is slow to set boundaries. Someone who wants to keep you tethered doesn't need to threaten you. They just need to remind you, gently and often, of everything they've done for you. Not to celebrate the relationship, but to keep a ledger open in your mind that makes you hesitate before you ever say no to them. This is why some of the most controlling relationships in history have run not on cruelty, but on an oversupply of remembered favors. Debt doesn't have to be financial to be a leash. There's a linguistic pattern here that's worth training your ear to catch, because it shows up in the exact phrasing people use. Notice the difference between "I'm always here for you" and "after everything I've done for you." The first is an offer, freely renewed, that expects nothing back in the moment it's spoken. The second is an invoice disguised as a sentiment. The words sound similar. The grammar of obligation buried inside them is completely different. Once you start listening for that invoice language, you'll notice it in places you never clocked before. the friend who prefaces every request with a reminder of a past favor, the relative who brings up an old loan every time a new disagreement starts, the colleague who mentions how hard they worked on your behalf right before asking for something that benefits only them. None of these moments are accidents of phrasing. They're the debt collection notice of an unspoken contract, delivered with a smile so it doesn't feel like what it is. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why do so many capable, intelligent people fall for this repeatedly, across different relationships, different decades, different disguises of the same dynamic? The answer isn't stupidity. It's that most of us were never taught to evaluate help by its trajectory. We were taught to evaluate it by its intensity. A person who does a lot for you feels more trustworthy than a person who does a little, even when the person doing a little is teaching you to fish and the person doing a lot is quietly making sure you stay hungry. Intensity of gesture and quality of outcome are two completely separate variables, and almost nobody separates them until they've been burned enough times to build the habit deliberately. It's also worth understanding why this pattern is intensifying rather than fading in modern life, because the digital environment rewards the performance of help more than it ever has before. Public helpfulness is now a form of content. A screenshot of advice given, a public comment offering support, a post about always being there for someone. These get social credit in the form of likes and validation that private, quiet, unglamorous help never earns. This creates a structural incentive to help loudly and visibly rather than effectively and privately, because the algorithm rewards the performance, not the outcome. It doesn't mean everyone posting kindness online is performing. It means the incentive structure has shifted in a direction that makes performance more profitable than it used to be. And profitable incentives, left unexamined, tend to shape behavior whether or not the person doing the behaving notices it happening to them. So, let's build a working test you can run on any relationship where someone positions themselves as your helper, because recognizing the pattern only matters if you can act on it. Ask yourself 3 questions in this order. First, after their help, am I measurably more capable of handling this category of problem on my own next time? Or am I exactly as dependent as before? Second, does this person talk about my growth when I'm not in the room, or do they talk about their generosity? Third, and this one cuts deepest, how do they respond in real time the moment I succeed at something without their involvement at all? Real allies expand when you don't need them. Performers contract, deflect, or quietly manufacture a reason you still do. If you want to go one layer further, here's a 4th diagnostic that catches the subtler cases the first 3 sometimes miss. Notice what happens when you decline their help. A person offering real help accepts a no without much friction, mild disappointment at most, and then they move on. A person whose help is a bid for control responds to a no with something disproportionate. Sudden coldness, a wounded tone, a comment designed to make you feel guilty for protecting your own autonomy. The size of someone's reaction to being told, "I've got this," tells you more about their real motive than anything they said while offering to help in the first place. Watch the no, not the yes. The yes is where everyone performs well. The no is where the mask has the least time to prepare. There's a philosophical dimension to this worth naming, because it isn't only about spotting bad actors. It's about what kind of person you choose to become in response. The Stoics built an entire practical philosophy around the distinction between what is within your control and what is not, and one of the most underused applications of that idea is this. You cannot control whether someone offers you performative help. You can only control whether you accept the terms of dependence hidden inside it. Every time you take help, without asking what it costs you in autonomy, you are signing a contract you haven't read. The discipline isn't refusing all help. That would just replace one dysfunction with another, isolation dressed up as strength. The discipline is reading the fine print before you say yes. There's a companion idea from existentialist thought that sharpens this further. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote extensively about what he called bad faith, the ways people deceive themselves to avoid the discomfort of full responsibility for their own choices. Accepting comfortable, engineered dependency is a form of bad faith too, not just on the part of the person offering it, but on the part of the person accepting it. It is genuinely easier to let someone else hold your finances, your decisions, your sense of direction, than to build the competence yourself. Performative helpers succeed as often as they do because dependency in the short term feels like relief. The person who wants to stop being managed has to be willing to trade that short-term relief for the longer, harder discomfort of competence under construction. Nobody does that by accident. It has to be chosen repeatedly on days when the easier option is sitting right there being offered with a smile. There's also a harder truth buried in this. One most self-improvement content skips because it isn't comfortable. Sometimes you are the one performing help. Not maliciously, not consciously, but through the same mechanism, needing to be needed. Feeling most valuable when someone else is leaning on you. Unconsciously slowing down someone's growth because their dependence has quietly become part of how you feel secure. Self-mastery isn't just building a radar for other people's patterns. It's turning that same radar inward without flinching and asking whether your own generosity has ever had an invisible clause attached to it. The people who grow the fastest are the ones willing to catch themselves in the same dynamic they just learned to spot in others. If you recognize yourself in that description even slightly, here's a distinction that will do more good than guilt ever could. The difference between rescuing and supporting isn't the amount of effort you put in. It's whether your effort is aimed at someone's competence or at their comfort. Supporting someone through a hard month while they build a skill is not the same as solving the problem so thoroughly that the skill never gets built. A useful internal check is to ask, before you step in, am I about to do this for them? Or am I about to make it possible for them to do this themselves? Even if that's slower and less immediately satisfying for both of us, the slower option almost always feels less generous in the moment. It is almost always the more generous option in the long run. There's a practical language shift worth adopting once you've internalized all of this, because insight without a script tends to evaporate under real social pressure. When someone offers help that feels like it might carry a hidden clause, you don't need an accusation. You need a clarifying question delivered plainly. I appreciate that. What would you want in return, if anything? That single sentence does something remarkable. If the help was genuinely unconditional, the offer stands unchanged, and you've lost nothing. If the help had strings attached, asking the question directly often causes the offer to quietly shrink or disappear. Because covert contracts survive on being unspoken, naming them out loud tends to be enough to dissolve the ones that were never sincere in the first place. Here's a second script, useful for the moment after help has already happened, and the invisible invoice starts arriving in the form of guilt or subtle pressure. Rather than arguing about whether a debt exists, you can say, I'm grateful for that, and I want to be clear I never agreed to owe you anything specific in return. It sounds almost too direct to say out loud, and that discomfort is exactly why so few people ever say it, and exactly why the pattern survives as long as it does in most relationships. Directness is the natural predator of covert contracts. They cannot survive daylight. So what do you actually do differently starting today? 3 shifts. Concrete and immediate. Stop rewarding help with automatic trust. Reward it with observed outcomes over time instead, and give trust a probation period regardless of how kind someone sounds in the moment. Start naming covert contracts out loud before they calcify. If someone does something significant for you, ask directly what they expect in return, even if the question feels awkward, because the awkwardness of asking is far cheaper than the resentment of an unspoken debt discovered later. And build your own capability in every domain where someone else currently helps you, not because their help is necessarily fake, but because your independence is the only variable that tells you the truth about their motives. A real ally will help you build the ladder. Anyone who keeps taking the ladder away the moment you're close to climbing it was never trying to get you to the top. One final distinction, because it would be incomplete to end without it. None of this is an argument for cynicism. Most help in most people's lives is exactly what it appears to be. Plain, uncomplicated, generous. Treating every offer of kindness as a hidden trap is its own kind of dysfunction, and it will cost you real relationships with people who never deserve that suspicion. The goal isn't to distrust help, it's to evaluate it, the same way you'd evaluate any claim before building your life around it, calmly, over time, by watching what it produces rather than how warmly it's delivered. Trust that's earned through observed pattern is sturdier than trust that's granted through gratitude alone. And it's available to everyone willing to slow down long enough to look. The people who genuinely want to see you rise are rare, and they're identifiable by a very specific signature. Their help has an expiration date they're actively trying to reach. They are working to make themselves obsolete in your life. One skill, one boundary, 1 ounce of confidence at a time. Everyone else, no matter how warmly they phrase it, is asking you to stay exactly where you are, just comfortable enough not to leave, and dependent enough to keep coming back. Now you know the difference. Use it. If this changed the way you'll look at the next person who just wants to help, that's the whole point of this channel. Subscribe to MindForge. Like this video so more people see it, and share it with someone who needs to read the fine print on their next favor.